Dimitri was very likely the longest an echidna has ever been possessed by Enerjak, which honestly is an impressive feat in of itself. But considering that he spent most of that time buried underneath rubble, one has to wonder kind of if he was really all that successful in what he set out to do, and maybe what a more competent Enerjak might look like. That's what we're going to be looking at today, but just so you know, this is part of a two-part series examining the character of Enerjak, and I strongly suggest that you watch the first part if you haven't already seen it. When we left off, Enerjak had been expelled from Dimitri's body, and it would remain that way for quite some time. Dimitri would go on to mechanically enhance his aged body with the help of the Dark Legion, and despite the fact that he had lost Enerjak, Dimitri remained determined to regain his power in order to shape Mobius in his vision. He would even go as far as to kidnap Knuckles in an attempt to surgically figure out what made him so powerful. Dimitri hoped that he could use Knuckles as a way to repower himself with the power that he once had from his chaos siphoning device which Mammoth Mogul had sapped away from him. Unfortunately for Dimitri, this wouldn't be possible, and we'd have to fast forward a bit into the future, and it's here that we would meet Dr. Finitevus. Dr. Finitevus was one of the greatest echidna minds, but had unfortunately gone mad under similar circumstances to Dimitri. Finitevus would honestly play all sides in this story in order to achieve his goal. He would start by convincing the Dark Legion that he wished to resurrect Enerjak in order to defeat the Dingoes. Then he would go on to tell Dimitri that he could aid him in regaining his power if he let him do some surgery on him, but ultimately would just make him weaker and more dependent on him by removing his body and leaving him as this head inside of a glass ball. The doctor would then go on to convince Knuckles' father, the current guardian, Locke, to go search for the other guardians who had gone missing, thus leaving the Master Emerald in his hands. Oh, and by the way, those guardians weren't just missing, they were all pretty much largely deceased at the hands of Dr. Finitevus, who had experimented on them, and then once he learned what he could, he launched them into the Twilight Zone, which is basically a void, empty zone of nothingness. Dimitri later would attempt to escape from Finitevus and warn the Freedom Fighters as well as Eggman, but he would be too little too late at this point, as by this point Finitevus would have already reunited a now splintered Dark Legion into kidnapping Knuckles. Finitevus would explain to Knuckles that they need him to save their people, as the Eggman Empire had laid waste to about 90% of the Echidna people. Although he did kind of leave out the portion of it where Dr. Finitevus had disabled the security systems to allow Eggman to do all that. This would cause Knuckles to panic and attempt to use the Master Emerald to set things right. However, unbeknownst to Knuckles, Finitevus had been using his Dark Chaos powers to tamper with the Master Emerald. This new cursed Master Emerald supercharged Knuckles and allowed Enerjak to enter his body. This new Enerjak, in the body of a biologically altered being, would quickly pose a massive threat to the world of Mobius, as he effortlessly relocated every dingo to the desert, which seems to actually weirdly be a theme with Enerjak. And then he went on to Thanos-snap the General out of existence, also kind of a theme with Enerjak. Enerjak would even handle attacks from both Sonic and Shadow without really breaking a sweat, and he was only temporarily incapacitated by Eggman, who had made a temporary truce with the Freedom Fighters in order to stop Enerjak. Eggman would place Enerjak inside of one of his egg grapes, but this egg grape would hardly be able to contain Enerjak, as he managed to supercharge them and then destroy a massive portion of Eggman City. After laying waste to Eggman City, he would go on to do the same to Eggman's fleet, causing Eggman to retreat before he sustained more damage. Although powerful, this version of Enerjak wasn't without his limits, and he soon found himself needing to return to the Master Emerald for a recharge. And it's here that Sonic would finally catch up to Enerjak. Sonic would use the Master Emerald to supercharge himself in order to try and level the playing field. Unfortunately though, even in this super state, Sonic struggled to keep toe-to-toe with Knuckles. Luckily for Sonic, Locke paid the ultimate sacrifice while sitting atop the Master Emerald, and he managed to give his own life in order to save his sons. And with that, we've officially reached the end of Enerjak. Knuckles would go on to fight Finitevus multiple times, but this demigod was no more. Except, what if things went a little bit differently? For this, we need to look 200 years into the future in an alternate timeline. Just know that none of this will be taking place in the main world that we normally look at. In this future, Silver the Hedgehog trains with Mammoth Mogul. It's here that Silver's mentor informs him that someone from another universe has entered their own, and wishes that Silver goes to investigate. While searching for this, Silver would get shot by some kind of laser beam, and while pinned down, the intruder would show himself. And wait, hold on, that looks a little bit like Vector, doesn't it?
Find the computer room!
The two would fight until suddenly this metallic Vector would go on the run. This creature would attempt to attack Silver from behind, but luckily, Silver was saved by an elderly echidna. This echidna is Edmund, and in this universe, he is the last guardian. The two would attempt to figure out what this creature is, but before they really had much time to figure anything out, this creature would summon a warp ring and begin to disappear. Silver would follow close behind before the warp ring closed, and what he would find on the other side was a desolate world lacking any sunlight, and in front of him was a giant monument to Enerjak. Pretty shortly after this, Silver would be greeted by a whole gang of metallic chaotics, who would surround him, and even though they had the upper hand on Silver, he continued to fight against them and managed to hold his ground. Little did Silver know, Enerjak was watching all of this as it happened, and it would lead to him cutting things short with an echidna who we can assume is Remington. And yes, Remington is related to Knuckles somehow. Enerjak would sap away Remington's life before showing that he had done the same to countless others, and even having ended the life of Sonic and his own villains. Thankfully, Silver would find himself rescued by familiar faces, although with new names. These here are the last of the freedom fighters, and they explain that these creatures are known as prelates, which are beings created by Enerjak using cores, which are essentially the souls of fallen Mobians, and that these Mobians are all that stand between Enerjak and total world domination. The group would then take Silver back to their hidden headquarters, and it's here that Silver is shown what their plan is. It's a sword. They're going to poke Enerjak with a sword. But to be fair, this isn't just any sword, this is actually a magic sword, and it'll sap away Enerjak's powers. With Enerjak's power gone, they could then go on to take the cores and restore the lives of the fallen. Enerjak would then exclaim that he's always been watching, and he's known where their base is since the start, but he likes to toy with these freedom fighters for fun. Enerjak would destroy this quote-unquote hidden base, and then go on once again to summon the chaotic prelates, and on top of that he would summon the prelate of Julie Sue, which is Jani-Jak, which is actually this version's Lara Sue's mother, and then he would force them to fight their friends and loved ones. Silver would focus his attention on Enerjak, as he used his telepathic powers to launch the top of a building with Enerjak on it into the air. He would then go back to defeat Prelate Julie Sue, and the freedom fighters would continue to destroy the other prelates. With each prelate destroyed, Silver would hold on to their cores to stop Enerjak from using them. But Enerjak would eventually return and just watch them kind of curiously from the air. Eventually, Enerjak would land and use his immense power to demonstrate that, well, he's only let Silver believe that he had any chance in defeating him. He would plow through them, and with the cores once again lost, it's revealed that Enerjak has taken Scarlet, which is this world's version of Bunny, and that he's going to take her core to add to his collection. This enrages Demo, which is this world's version of Bean, who is also her significant other in this world, and honestly, it's kind of weird seeing him as a serious character and not a goofy Bean the Dynamite. Enerjak would then go on to take both their cores pretty effortlessly, and he would go on to pound Silver into the ground. With Silver stuck into the ground, Enerjak would then defeat pretty much every one of the freedom fighters and take all of their cores, with the exception of Jani-Jak. Enerjak would basically do that typical villain thing where he just kind of monologues for way too long while holding up Jani-Jak as he talked about how he wanted to rule the world with his family, and this would give Silver just enough time to power himself up and free himself. An incredibly frustrated Silver would then launch a giant stone fist right at Enerjak, but despite the size of this, Enerjak would just punch through it like it was nothing. Both Silver and Enerjak would have a superpowered fight in the air, with the two of them honestly being pretty closely matched, and Enerjak just barely beating out Silver. Enerjak would go on to summon a prelate army, and plus 10 points to anyone who can name all of these characters shown on screen right now. Jani-Jak would take on the prelates as Silver went back at it again with Enerjak, taking him into a psionic hold and dragging him across Angel Island, through rivers and mountains, and making the mistake of believing that he had managed to kill Enerjak. Of course, though, he didn't, and Enerjak returned to the air pretty much undamaged. It's here that Silver would remember the words of his masters, about the corruption that power can bring to one, and how nothing can ever really beat chaos but chaos itself. This causes Silver to have an epiphany, and he uses his psionic powers to redirect Enerjak's attacks to him, which finally manages to cause some kind of significant damage to Enerjak, as nothing in this world is more powerful than Enerjak, so of course Enerjak should be able to hurt himself. Silver would continue to harm Enerjak in this way until finally Enerjak had enough and attempted to lunge himself at Silver to finish him off. But suddenly he found himself frozen in midair, just inches away from the magic sword which had stunned him. Jani-Jak would go on to recite a chant which took Enerjak's powers away from Knuckles, but this power wouldn't be returned to the Chaos Force. Instead, we would find a new incarnation of Enerjak standing over the weak and decrepit Knuckles. This was Jani-Jak, or Jani-Jak as I've seen her called online, but unlike previous Enerjaks, she doesn't seem corrupted by Enerjak. Instead, she seemed fully in control and ready to restore the world to its former glory. The weakened Knuckles would thank Jani-Jak for saving him, but would mention that he needs some of his power back so that he can help her rebuild. Of course, Jani-Jak could tell that this now free Knuckles, after years of corruption, was still mad, and he could not be trusted with any kind of power. So she destroyed the sword, which would contain any remaining power, leaving Knuckles to grovel on the floor over the sword. With that, we come to the end of Enerjak, as we've seen all the incarnations that they've taken within the Archie Sonic comics. Silver would return to his timeline, and Jani-Jak would go on to restore her home as a benevolent being, as the first Enerjak to actually seem to use her powers for good. With that, we've reached the end of our saga, and I want to thank you for watching it this far along. I've wanted to do a video on Enerjak for a really long time, but I've never really felt well enough equipped to do it, and so sincerely I want to thank everybody who supported me for the past almost a year now to get to this point. Typically, I thank someone at the end of my video if they've helped inspire me to make a video, but I can't quite pin down one person alone who suggested Enerjak, as a lot of people have throughout the time, so I'm just going to kind of pick one at random that I stumbled on first, and that person is Cassidy Arnold. So thank you, Cassidy, and of course, thank you to everybody else who suggested such a fun character to look at. If you feel like I've earned any kind of like, subscribe, comment, or whatever, feel free to do that, but as always, you don't have to, and I just hope that you have a good day. About the corruption that power can bring, and about the corruption that power can bring, about the power